Welcome, everybody. My name is Roger Durling. I'm the Executive Director of the Santa Barbara International Film Festival, and welcome to this conversation about the amazing film Greyhound, which is directed by Aaron Schneider. And we also have the director of photographer with us, Shelly Johnson. The Variety magazine reviewer mentioned, what was it like to fight World War II? For those of us who will never know, that question has 1,000 answers. Greyhound does a sturdy job of depicting one of them. The film is directed by Aaron Schneider, and whose 2009 debut film, Get Low, starring Robert Duvall, Sissy Spacek, and Bill Murray, was honored as Best First Feature at the Independent Spirit Awards. And he's also a former cinematographer. His directing career began after winning an Oscar for his short film adaptation of William Faulkner's Two Soldiers. And with us is the director of cinematography, Shelly Johnson, who has done numerous works, but Captain America, The First Avenger, is one of my favorite films, and he also has worked on Hidalgo, amongst many other films. So please welcome Aaron Schneider and Shelly Johnson. Guys, thanks for being here. I want to start right off. I was mentioning to Shelly before you came on board, Aaron, that I don't recall a film in a very long time where I was so aware of reactions. I'm totally immersed and involved in watching people's faces, in facial expressions. Was that, can you talk, both of you talk about that? And was that something that was challenging to tell the story with so many reactions?
Right. Well, when I read the script, you can imagine what it would be like to read the screenplay. And, you know, most people, when they read a screenplay, key into the dialogue, and a lot of the story flows through, you know, the natural kind of communication between human beings, whether it's a lawyer and his client, or, you know, but the dialogue in this screenplay was almost sort of cursory, in the sense that the real drama was what was going on outside, and it was the tactical dilemma, or it was the no-win scenario, or it was the apprehension or the fear of making one choice over another, or the logistics of figuring out how to defeat the enemy. And the dialogue was just sort of almost tonal. And so the first, you know, challenge we faced was knowing that the movie lived underneath the dialogue. It lived out the window. You know, it lived in, you know, behind Krause's eyes, in terms of what he was running through his mind, and for Shelly and I, that translated into a kind of a relentless handheld camera, a relentless subjective point of view, where the center of the whole story is moving with Krause. He's taking us to what the story sees. He's connecting us to the parts of the ship that we are gonna see, and he's sort of the focal point. And that translated visually to almost kind of a visual character study.
Mm-hmm. And Shelly, how did you develop the language with the camera and what Aaron was speaking about?
Well, you know, what's interesting is, you know, so much of the movie, because of the procedural dialogue, was open to interpretation. And that interpretation kind of evolved as we prepared the movie and even got into shooting. You know, I might read the script and have my own ideas about what Krause is doing and why he's doing it. And then our discussions with Aaron, you know, those ideas get developed a little more. Then when we finally see the actors doing it, that's sort of the final interpretation of what the scene's about. And what was really interesting was, you know, in the rehearsal period, you know, after the rehearsal, Aaron was able, for me, to piece together a whole inner narrative of everything that was the white part of the page, if you will, and everything that was happening between the words, points that he wanted to really bring out, because it's not represented in words. A lot of it need to be represented in visuals. And so that manifested for me a lot with camera performance, as I like to term it. The camera operators really needed to become involved and key into what these narrative facets were that Aaron wanted to bring out. And that can come out in all different ways. Just the slightest little camera move, a little move in at the precise moment, or a little glint in the eye. And there's a lot of little details that we can bring out. I mean, the movie is sort of built on its details, where it very much has a cumulative effect. And so we wanted to more or less teach the audience what this world was about, and let them sort of immerse into it. And the visuals were a big part of that.
Yeah, there was a bit of a destroyer lesson going on underneath it, right?
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
You know, so much of the drama is built on, for example, there's that sequence where one of the talker who relays instructions from below the ship to the captain, right, where he sneezes. And, you know, it's hopefully one of the most tense moments in the opening act of the film, a sneeze, right? And it's like, okay, how are you going to make a sneeze into something that, you know, turns it into a white knuckle situation? Well, for anyone who's seen the film, you now know that there's a line of communication that has to move in an analog fashion from here to here to here, and then back again, and then back. And anything that interrupts that line of communication becomes extremely dangerous. But before the audience can appreciate it as dangerous, they have to understand the chain of command, or the chain of communication. They've got to intuit it. They've got to know how it's got to work before I can throw a wrench in it, or before the story can. And so we were giving, you know, we had to bury almost destroyer lessons, World War II communicate, you know, naval tactical kinds of lessons inside here. When you first hear him say radar, surface radar, there's a sequence where he says, I hope you see him on surface radar. And we cut downstairs and we introduce you to the radar screen. And then we cut directly up to the radar in the mast spinning as it looks out over the surface. And those three quick cuts, although they go by really quickly, are designed to sort of point you at the foundational basics of surface radar, so that when I talk about it again later, you've got a mental picture of it and you can use that as a part of engaging in the story. So visually, it was also our job to kind of inform along the way, not just tell the story, not just get behind Krause's performance and find the human way into this experience, but also to instruct.
Which leads me to my next question, is that you, and we'll get into it, you defy a lot of conventions in this film. And you alluded to one is that you do not condescend to the audience. We hear so much, terminology, procedural language in running the warship, but you never explain or condescend to us what's it all about. Can you discuss that, both of you, that choice of not condescending to us?
Well, it all started with Tom's script. I remember reading a line of description. In fact, it was where the radar was first introduced early on. And he wrote a line of description that went something along the lines of, the first time we see this, it will make no sense until later. And I remember reading that and thinking as a director, okay, I get it. I know, I now understand what he wants to do as a screenwriter. And he wants to do exactly that. He wants to let you engage in the process of, there's actually this, Shelly, or do you guys remember that video game from the 90s, Myst? Or,
yeah, absolutely, yeah.
You know those games where they drop you into this world and say, go, and you go where, right? Like, I don't know what to do here. And you start clicking on things and picking up and look and educating yourself. And it's really an immersive experience. I got lost in these kinds of games because I wanted to, before I could even start playing, I had to understand my world, right? And I think that's a really, movies have that same potential in terms of putting you into a world you've never been in and making you lean into the world and go, what is this? This is crazy. This is cool. And so that was actually kind of Tom's, that was his approach as a writer. And I just picked up on that. But of course that's responsibility. It doesn't do any good to drop you into this video game, to continue the metaphor. It doesn't do you any good to drop you into the video game if the video game doesn't have the answers that you're looking for. Like when you say, what is this? If the game doesn't tell you, then the game gets boring, right? So now it's our responsibility as filmmakers, when we drop you into this experiential world, it's our job visually to give you the little nuggets of information that you can put in your back pocket to use to make the rest of the experience interesting for you.
Yeah, I mean, I was able to understand the procedures, and Shelly, like, for example, when Tom Hanks says that, we are going to stop zigzagging, we're going to go directly across, and it cuts to Charlie measuring on the map. Can you, were those things challenging for you to work on? What things do I show? What things do I don't show?
Yeah, well, early on, Aaron, in fact, in the job interview, Aaron told me, what I want my DP to do is learn how a destroyer works and learn how one of these Atlantic crossings operates. And he wanted to know about this communication line. What happens when they get a target either on sonar or radar, and what is their strategy? How do they plot against it? And how do they communicate back and forth this information? And he said, I want you to learn about maritime weather and, the seascape and how the ship works, because you're going to be in charge of teaching the audience how this all works. And he said, plus in the heat of production, I want you to be able to say, oh, we need this essential cutaway because this is a key link to how this information comes together. And so that education came from being in Baton Rouge, where there is a restored Fletcher-class destroyer that serves as a museum that sits on the Mississippi River. That's kind of permanently moored there. Mm-hmm. And so we shot the movie in Baton Rouge, and a lot of our prep was in and around this ship. And so I was able to talk to a lot of the veterans from the ship and the people who run that museum, who could take me down to the Command Information Center where Charlie worked and show me exactly how it all worked, how all that mapping worked. And we had a number of experts who were with us who could advise us, but we were wanting very much for that authenticity with those types of details, for those to be right and thorough, to follow a complete chain of communication.
Aaron, in my perception, there is two narratives going on at the same time. There is the battle that is playing outside of the pilot house, and then there is the internal battle which is ongoing in Tom Hanks. Can you discuss balancing those two struggles, those two battles happening simultaneously?
Yeah. It's interesting. Shelly mentioned a little while ago that when we finally did get the rehearsal up, and it was real, it was in front of us. You could imagine, as a director, you could imagine the human current, underneath what's going on, and you can sort of prepare yourself. I know that the character is thinking this or questioning that, or he's run into this dilemma, and I need to make sure I, hit that visually. But it isn't until the actors get it on their feet, and that, because he is a first-time commander, there's a lot of there's a sort of a cloud hanging over the room, a cloud of uncertainty and fear, some of which is directed at Krause, because they know that this is this guy's first crossing, and that creates pressure on Krause. And there's other dynamics at work. And this is what Shelly means when he talks about the white of the page, in between, there's human dynamics in any screenplay that just, they're in between the words. And so when we got it on its feet, and I mixed what my preconceived notions were about where the story lived with what we saw, then you very quickly, I suppose this would date back to my roots in television, where you'd come in at 7 a.m. when I was shooting Stephen Bochco's, Murder One show, for example. You show up at 7 a.m. and there's 3 actors, dead dog tired, and you're tired, and they say action on the rehearsal, and you run through the scene and you decide how you're going to block it out. And then the AD said, all right, go to the makeup trailer. And then they turn to the cinematographer, right, Shelly? And they go, all right, how much time you need? And of course, if you say anything more than half an hour, you're in big trouble. 30 minutes late. So in this, you get this flashpoint of opportunity to put the scene up, see what it feels like, looks like, see how it inspires your own preconceived ideas, mix them together, translate that into a plan of action, get it lit, and go. Because this was a very quick shoot. This was a 35-day shoot. This was not by any means a perfect storm or In the Heart of the Sea or Saving Private Ryan. This was an independent film made for probably less than half of those other films. And we had to move quickly. And so to answer your question, I brought ideas into it, where I needed to be and what I needed to emotionally to make the scene work on the human side. But once it came to life, then Shelly and I would team up and we'd laser focus on what other opportunities we might see that we could pull out of it. And then we'd devise a plan. And of course that had to marry up with other plans that I had preconceived that have to do with marrying all this up with a battle that isn't even going to exist until we get into post. And that was the challenge. That's what made it unique. That's what made it difficult, but it's also what made it fun.
You mentioned talkers, and I have a question, a follow-up on that. And that was always in the script, but what I greatly admire about the talkers is that there was a repetition, and there was a rhythm created that it was almost percussive in the dialogue, where you heard Charlie, command, and then you heard the talker repeating. And, can you discuss?
Yeah.
Was that always in the script?
Yeah, I'm glad you picked up on that. I've told this story before, but it's really illustrative. Part of my inspiration was that scene in the beginning of Close Encounters, where the air traffic controller gets a call from the pilot, and the pilot's seeing a UFO, and the whole thing is from the point of view of the air traffic control room, and you're hearing all of this procedural dialogue. It's almost like police dispatch. Whenever movies want to make whenever cop shows want to make something sound really cool, they always throw in that classic dispatch dialogue because it gives it such a texture and veracity of real life, right? Well, in the air controller room, they're telling airplanes to turn right, descend to 3,000, maintain, over, and they're like descending 3,000, maintain, over. And there's a sense of it's like you're in church. It's like you're in this world that operates on its own, with its own language and its own rhythms. And those rhythms, especially, you understand inherently that the rhythms of an air traffic controller are key, aren't they? Because big things are at stake. And then inside of this procedural air traffic control room, suddenly there's a wrench, there's a fly in the ointment. There's I see something, and right. And so you begin to realize that like Greyhound, this scene is about a procedural environment where the language and tempo of the dialogue gives you a stage, a platform under which, you know, very, very serious drama can take place. In this case, a UFO that's about to collide with an airplane. And by the way, you're not cutting to the UFO, you're not cutting to the pilot. All you're hearing is voices, which also kind of parallels Greyhound in the sense of him always communicating. He hears voices, he speaks to people that are out there, but you never really cut there. And then the radar screen, you see the UFO approaching the airplane, and not unlike our radar screens, and you begin to see that this could be a really powerful visual approach to setting drama underneath a procedural. So I think to answer your question, before that whole concept can work, right, you have to set the rhythms, the tones. You have to set the language has to sort of fill the whole universe to set the tone for what's then going to happen dramatically or tactically underneath it. And those rhythms, you know, those rhythms are key. And hopefully they also give the scene energy. Like hopefully you're like, oh my God, you know, this information's got to get from here to here to here fast enough for this to happen. And I hope it gets there fast enough because the U-boat's, you know, about to get away. And so in that sense, the rhythm of the dialogue becomes part of the thriller aspect.
Yeah, and also, and what I loved about it is that it also felt like an echo that I thought was in Krause's mind, that,
Yeah.
you know, all the ongoing questioning that he's going through, and then you have this repetition that I mean, my interpretation was that it was echoing in his mind as well.
That's a great observation. You know, it also creates opportunities for Tom to build a performance, believe it or not. Like there's that beat, you know, how do you build a performance on bearing? You know, what's the bearing? Well, in the opening scene, there's a point at which the talker gives him distance 600 feet or 600 yards. And he turns and he goes, bearing, right? And then talker says, you know, bridge sonar bearing. And then, you know, having left out the bearing, it gives Captain Krause a chance to externalize his level of anxiety. And, how, you know, it gives Tom, the actor, something to work with in terms of conveying his character's state of mind. You know, what the hell's the bearing, you know? So in that sense, what would otherwise be procedural dialogue is also the foundation for a performance. I mean, you know, Tom doesn't get soliloquies, you know, in this. If you enjoy Tom's performance as much as I do, you have to realize he's saying numbers and asking people for information, yet being this experience for us at the same time. That was an amazing, you know, when you think about any type of script an actor could write for himself or herself. You know, Tom didn't write himself any, you know, dying speeches, you know. It's very spare, and he built this whole performance on his own desire to find a different way of communicating with an audience, an experience.
Following on the idea of the conventions that you both defy in this film, I want to ask you about the changing of characters, because we're used to in war movies that no matter how long the trek is, we have the same captains, the same crew, you know, the whole time. But every 4 hours, you guys were changing characters, it's not conventional. Was that a challenge for you guys?
Shelly could answer this, because one of the things he did, which was so helpful with respect to these changing watches you're talking about, is he created a kind of thesis for how his lighting could subtly change in these little chunks of time that were organic to the script to give that sense of time passage, because you're right. Krause is the constant and the crews keep circling in and out on different watches, and it's meant to give you a sense of time passage and convey that he's there. He's not going anywhere. Even as these guys go to sleep and come back the next day, he's the one constant. And to support that, we had to address it photographically.
Yeah, I mean, I love the idea that Krause.
Oh, did we lose Shelly there for a second?
I think I'm still here. Can you see
Yeah,
me?
yeah, I can hear you. Yeah, I
Shelley,
think that
Shelley's frozen in mine.
it's frozen in thought. But maybe you can address it, Aaron. I noticed subtle changes where, there were red tones, and I knew that there was a new crew,
Right.
and there was, different vocabulary happening.
By the way, Shelley, if you're listening and you can hear us, one of the things that's worked for me is to leave the meeting and log back in, for what that's worth. Yeah, what he did is he created this this syllabus where he would, there's 4 or 5 watches per 24-hour period. And of course, at different times of day, dusk, dawn, afternoon. And the whole film was going to take place in the stormy North Atlantic, which meant that even inside of this oppressive, gray, stormy environment, there still needed to be change. We're in one location and we're in one part of the ocean for the whole film, and we didn't want it to get visually monotonous. And so Shelley found very interesting ways of tweaking. One morning was a little more golden, one morning was a little more cold, one was a little more gray, one stormy sequence had a patch of sky where the sun was fighting to come out, so that there was a little bit more of a softer, hazier sun. And then of course, when you get to the end of the film and they've received air cover, the sun does finally crack out a little bit in a kind of a morning mist and lift the shadows up, paralleling the emotional tone of the film towards the end. So he had this syllabus and then he programmed it into the lighting so that he could pre-light these things on his computer, his iPad, and get a sense of a starting point photographically. And then when we were working quickly and we jumped from this scene to this scene, he goes, okay, he'd tell his gaffer to pull up, that pre-light that we're going to use for this watch on this day. And that gave him a starting point from which he could then mold it and make it fit the scene, so that when the whole thing came together at the end, it had a temporal rhythm to it photographically.
Mm-hmm. Well, while we wait for Shelley to join us, tell us about how you got involved in the project. It is Tom Hanks' screenplay, and it's based on The Good Shepherd, which is C.S. Forester's novel. And he, well known because he wrote The African Queen, and he also wrote the Horatio Hornblower stories. Were you familiar with his work, and how did you get involved in the production?
Shelley just texted me. He's on his way back. He had a battery failure problem.
Oh, okay.
So he'll be back momentarily. So you're saying, how did I get into the project originally?
Yes.
The script came from my agent. The way, sometimes it works in this business. And as soon as I heard World War II Tom Hanks, I was like, do I even need to read this? But then what I noticed is that it said written by Tom Hanks. And you mentioned earlier my short film, Two Soldiers. That for me was
Oscar winner.
Yeah, was a big career change. I took my life savings in my early 30s, put it in a bank account and spent it on a film that was designed to steer the Titanic from cinematography to directing. And of course, I didn't know at the time it was going to be that successful, but it was an investment in myself. And it was a big turning point and a big time in my life. And obviously it turned out great. But it was a really important time in my career. And when I saw Tom's name there, you know, we don't often think that people like Tom Hanks have dreams and wishes, you know, because their careers are so amazing and their body of work so rich. What could they possibly need that they don't have? But the truth is, everyone out there has these little ideas in their back pocket that they, you know, wouldn't it be cool if I could, or I wish I could, or would it be fun to try this, you know? And so when I saw his name, I thought, how cool would it be if this ends up being one of those for Tom, like one of these things that, and it turns out that's exactly what it was. He'd been working on it in the background, kind of a pet project, and experimenting here and there with different ways he might be able to do it. And he finally got up the gumption to put it out there and see if it could become a real boy. And that's when I got a hold of it, and I saw his name and I thought, man, if that's what he's trying to do, I'm in. Because one thing to work for Tom or work with Tom as your leading man, it's another to sort of join up on a pet project where you know he's going to be invested in so many other ways, right? And having admired his work as a fit and acted, and you know, he's overseen he's produced things like Band of Brothers and Earth
The Pacific.
You know, so he's a filmmaker, and I'm like, and that's the most fun thing about this business, is getting to work with other people whose work you admire. And so I don't get to just work with Tom Hanks, the actor I admire. I get to work with Tom Hanks, the producer that I admire. And so I freaked out, and I sent an email to my agent and said, this could be the coolest thing ever. And somehow, as the story goes, it got forwarded on to the head of the agency and Tom's agent, and who apparently read it to him over the phone. So this effusive email made it directly to Tom's ear. And he said, "Wow, sounds like he's excited. Why don't you send him in and I'll sit down with him." And so I went in and sat down with Tom, and we spent 2 or 3 hours just chatting. He had his dog Cleo with him, and I was in the room there with all the Band of Brothers Emmys, and he told me stories about the people he'd work with. He does great imitations of all the directors he works with. He does impersonations as he tells his story. He's got a great Bob Zemeckis impersonation, and an even better Penny Marshall impersonation. And we talked about filmmakers, filmmaking. I asked him about some cinematographers that were my heroes that he'd gotten to work with. Gordon Willis from Godfather fame, and Conrad Hall from American Beauty and Road to Perdition fame. Hey, why don't you come back in and meet my partner, Gary Getzman? And before you know it, we were all three, making a movie.
Were you familiar at all about the Battle of the Atlantic? I had never heard about this, and it's such fascinating to find out, in this film, so much about it.
Yeah, it's interesting, when you really think about it, when you think about the way, just the logistics of the way troops and food and weapons move around the world during a war, if you really stop and think about it, things in those days had to be shipped, and if supplies and food and troops are crucial to a war, then you got to know that the enemy is going to be after them, which means by definition, any of these movements, any of these support lines that fed the war were vulnerable to attack, because if you could knock it out there, it would never happen on land. If you knocked out a troop ship or a supply of food, then there's a whole regiment that can't fight, and there's a whole regiment that goes hungry. And so, it's this battle behind the scenes that is not as well represented in film history. There's some really great films made in the 50s and 60s in this world, but then the genre kind of died off a little bit. And then there's, of course, Das Boot, which is a fantastic movie. But so I knew conceptually this was part of the war, but in terms of the air cover, the black pit, the methods by which U-boats would attack and the methods by which destroyers would counterattack, this was all new to me. So I had enough time that I spent months and months creating my own research. In fact, I built a website as I researched,
wow.
wiki links and YouTube videos and images, and I created a website so that as I collected research and information, I could format it in such a way that when the crew came on later, I could send them the link to this website, and it was all categorized with different, depth charges, uniforms, guns, 40 millimeter, and each department could take a deep dive into the research I had time to do beforehand.
Welcome back, Shelly.
Yeah.
Something good? Yeah.
Oh,
We talked all about your color coding and your lighting design throughout to tell time. But I have a question, which I've studied what you guys did, but the audience listening, you guys shot in USS Kidd, and then you built a set which was the pilot house and the bridge, where you could go with your camera from the outside to the inside and vice versa. And then the battle sequences were done afterwards. Could you walk us through all of that? And was that a major challenge to go from those three different worlds?
Oh yeah, certainly. I think that having the kid there to spend time on and get to know was invaluable. And for me, even just to see how the natural light worked and knowing that we really wanted a sense of naturalism for the piece, and being able to then go onto the set and try to use that light as inspiration and try to create that same type of naturalism and realism on the set was
Roger, are you hearing him well enough?
Yeah, I am.
Okay. For some reason, I don't hear him. Sorry to interrupt, Shelly.
No worries. For us on stage, we had a couple of unusual approaches where typically on this type of movie where you'd have green screen and to extend into your backgrounds. And of course, you may have already talked about how our backgrounds were designed and prepped. What my foreground lighting was intended to continue into came out of our discussions and preparation. So we ended up using white screen on stage instead of a green screen, which allowed for this very kind of all-encompassing light from all angles to come in and reflect and have that dance that light has and that naturalism that involves the characters and involves the camera. And that was technically a very different kind of thing. And all of that kind of came in service to the narrative. Our goal was to not be captive to the technical, our technical obstacles, was to free our minds of that technical side and access the narrative, since it was written in such a procedural way. We knew that we needed to interpret, and we knew we needed our full brainwidth to do that. And so we endeavored, very much to focus on the narrative and the storytelling and depart from the technique as much as we could.
Hey, Shelly, a lot of us are having trouble hearing you. Has anything changed mechanically from the first time you were on?
Is this better?
Yep, there it is.
Okay.
There it is. Now we can hear you.
I'm so sorry.
No,
I had a
it's all
power
right.
interruption.
We're going to have to bring you in for ADR on that last one.
Okay.
I want to bring up the work of Blake Neely, because you both have mentioned what a experiential film this is. And the sound is so instrumental, from the pitch that we hear whenever the gray wolf appears. Um, uh, can you tell us about adding the score and working with Blake Neely in the sound design?
Yeah. Well, it's always fun when the movie starts coming to life that way. And, it's obviously, anything you do in a movie is about point of view. What the cinematography has a point of view, the director has a point of view, the music should have a point of view. And I think the music takes on a sort of a point of view of the maritime drama. It's sort of the big picture. But as far as sound design goes, it was fun and a challenge as well, because the sounds of the destroyer can bring, we were talking earlier about chains of communication. The ping of sonar is like a heartbeat. It's also like a metronome. You were mentioning the dialogue rhythms. The same goes for the rhythm of the search, right? And funny enough, we were shooting insert shots of the sonar room, and I noticed, and having done my research, I noticed a knob that said pulse rate. And I remember learning that when a destroyer sends a ping out, what a destroyer is doing with that ping is it's sending sound waves out into the water. And if it bounces off of a submarine, then that sound wave bounces back at the destroyer and registers, right? If there's nothing out there, the sound just keeps going on through the water. If it hits something, it comes back. And but as you sneak up on a sub, particularly in that opening sub chase, as you get closer and closer and closer to a sub, if you can imagine, the speed of sound is such that the closer you get to the sub, the more often you can ping. In other words, the closer it gets, the more times you can ping to get a position on that sub. If it's a mile away, it takes longer for the sound to go back out and come back. And the closer it gets, it's less time, right? And so the sonar systems had a pulse rate so that you could send more pulses. The closer you got to the sub, the more pulses you could send, so that the more accurate readings you could take in a shorter amount of time. And I remember thinking, let's shoot that, because as we get closer to the sub and these pings, boom, boom, right? I can actually, like a composer, a composer would speed up the score to enhance the oncoming climax of a sequence, right? And I realized if I use this pulse rate somewhere at a critical moment in the scene to double the speed of my pings, I'm essentially, kind of underscoring. I'm kind of scoring the movie with sound. It's like a heartbeat getting faster. And then, hopefully a composer picks up on something like that and runs with it. And it all becomes one unified idea. So yeah, my philosophy with music and sound has always been, pick a point of view, and then let sound and music sort of dance together.
Your film has this very unrelenting pace, and then it has this lyrical pause in it. Can you, both of you, tell us about that sequence, the funeral sequence, and how it was shot and the importance of the scene?
We got lucky with that, didn't we, Shelly? We knew we needed this was one of the biggest days on the ship exterior, which meant that if we wanted any change on the set, we could make all kinds of cloudy light we wanted. Mm-hmm. But when we went on the destroyer, if the sun was out, we had a couple of little postage stamps to help block a little bit of sun. But we were holding our fingers, trying to nail a section of cloudy day so that we could have the right tone and feeling for that service at the stern of the ship. Remember that?
Yeah, they were all wider shots. And, one of my favorite funeral scenes in a movie, if you remember the funeral in the film Giant,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That funeral scene, there's almost no dialogue in it. And it's composed largely of wider shots. And we had the connection with Tom. And of course, the thing when George Cleveland gets slid into the ocean and he gets hung
fumble.
up on which was actually an accident, as I recall, Aaron. It
was
happened.
It was an accident in the shooting.
No, it's scripted.
Oh, it is scripted.
It was scripted.
We composed a lot of wider shots. I think we had 4 cameras to shoot that because it was going to be a fleeting moment, and we wanted to get as many angles as we could. And when I thought back on the scene from Giant, that funeral, which was a very personal funeral, for a veteran, and what made it to me meaningful were the wider shots and the composition of the world that this person left. And that's something that related to me. And I particularly like the communication to the bridge where they stop the engines, and the film, the ship becomes very still in the water, and there's this focused respect in the middle of this, warscape for these three gentlemen that they're going to put to rest, and then it all starts right back up again. And so, yes, we did. Yeah.
And you, in that moment where there is that, I call it a fumble, with the flag, you insert it took my breath away, the reaction from Tom Hanks. And it's a few seconds. You just watch him react. It's a beautiful, beautiful sequence.
Well, you're describing what we were talking about earlier, where the story doesn't live in the dialogue. It doesn't live in the places that the story usually lives in for movies. Turning a whole scene, like that's the scene. That moment you're talking about is the real, what makes, yes, a military funeral is an effective and dramatic thing to watch, but this is a story about a captain. So, okay, inside of that, what is his experience, right? First thing he's doing is he's reading the prayer, right? But the real drama in the scene is this little detail, this little thing that happens that in its own really bizarre way could ruin everything, right? It could take it could steal the whole moment, not only from Krause and the men, but from the audience as well. So there's a little drama when that body gets held up. It's like, you're like, oh my God, you're kidding me. No way. And then very quickly thereafter, you get through it. And Tom's reaction that you're talking about is selling that anxiety. He's the audience. He's saying, you got to be kidding. This is not happening. Please, this is not happening. Right? Imagine being yourself being at a funeral, and something as simple as when the coffin gets lowered, imagine if a belt gave away and a coffin did something that broke the church-like feeling of the occasion. It's horrifying inside of this event, inside of this
but at
ceremony.
the same time, it's so human. I mean,
Right.
And it adds a touch, a really strong touch of humanity as well.
But see, it's directly related. How we were talking about the sneeze. The sneeze can't be dramatic unless it interrupts the procedural nature of the way they communicate. Likewise, that little holdup in the body coming off the stretcher can't be dramatic unless you feel like you're looking at a procedural process that has such gravitas and sanctity that something that minuscule could ruin everything, right? So you have to have the sense of procedure and expectation for that before anything can throw it off course. So the sneeze and the stretcher are kind of similar. It's the same kind of structure.
I want to bring up XO Charlie. and also bring up Cleveland, where we don't hear them speak that much, but we know so much about them at the same time. Is that something that you guys created a background to, a backstory to all of them? Like, for example, Cleveland, the fact that he's an African American, we've rarely seen in the naval ship an African American, and he's a mess man. You know, he's serving food and tending. At the same time, he's loading torpedoes. Did you guys discuss, and as I said, created a backstory to all the different characters?
Well, Cleveland was a character that Tom added. He was not in the book, and Tom purposefully added him because he wanted to represent as diverse a representation of the men who served as possible. And so Cleveland, you know, not to mention the fact that the original novel put what the Keeling in the original novel was in Her Majesty's Navy, was British, and we turned it into an American destroyer, which changes the culture, which changes the history, which changes some of the language, and so on and so forth. But yeah, it's a credit to the actors. You know, at first it started with Tom's desire to make the kind of movie where the actors had to create their own stories and communicate them somehow. Then it was up to us to cast as brilliant actors as we could that had the skill set to do that kind of thing. I'm so proud of all the really wonderful actors, many of them, you know, budding stars in their own right, who are willing to come in and take on the challenge, right, of, in some cases, being atmospheric. They are not foreground parts. Nonetheless, they are absolutely crucial to telling the story and to telling Krause's story. And there was just, and all these actors were just so generous and came in and filled up their parts and made them hyper real, so that with the real estate they had to tell their story, they could. And of course, some of it's in the writing. One of the lines that Tom and I came up with when we first meet Cleveland, there's a quick exchange where Cleveland says, "You sleep okay, Captain?" And the captain says, "I've never had the gift for sleeping on board." Mm-hmm. And Cleveland says, "And I can't sleep anywhere else, sir." And with that quick exchange, you set up, that's essentially all we have to set up their dynamic and to understand their relationship to each other. But it's all there, right? It's like, you know, immediately when he says, "And I can't sleep anywhere else, sir," that this job, this lifestyle, this is his life, it has been his life, and it is the love of his life. That's why he sleeps so well. Not to mention it foreshadows that he'll be put to rest forever out here in the ocean. Whereas Krause, the newbie, right, hasn't found the skill set to get a good night's sleep on board, so that at the end of the movie, when he finally lays down and just zonks out, in some ways, you know, he has earned, you know, he has found his ability. You know, it's a trial by fire, and he now has found the ability to sleep just fine after these, you know, after this 3-day event. So yeah, there are these little landmines of nuggets of information built into the screenplay that actors like Rob Morgan and Stephen Graham latch onto and build for them, you know, build a character for themselves, and then try and fill it out so that when you watch a movie and you comment that they feel that way to you, that's a credit to them.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of small nuggets, Elizabeth Shue, Evelyn, what a crucial role, not only in that small little scene that we have with Evelyn, we get quick snippets of exposition. She's the one that tells us about Pearl Harbor. She's the one that tells us that he's been passed over. she hands the, which I thought it was a throwaway. She's the one that hands in the monogram slippers,
Yep.
and then later on in the story becomes pivotal. And she gets the yesterday, today, and
Yeah.
forever. Can you tell us about? I mean, it's such a concise, precise scene. Can you tell us about that? And then Shelley, I have a follow-up also about that scene.
Yeah, what you're describing, the type of film Tom wrote, he wanted to write a very streamlined, procedural, experiential film. And I think maybe some people bring certain expectations to the movie. When they see someone like an Elizabeth Shue character show up, Evie, they have certain expectations of what that is, where it should go, how they've seen women like that in movies past, and what her narrative function is. Oh, there's the girl, I get it, okay. And then all of a sudden, we'd learn that she's simply a jumping off point for a different kind of story. And I think that probably rubs some people the wrong way. But what Tom's doing is he's using, like that scene I took you through a minute ago with Krauss in Cleveland. He's packing these very economic little nuggets of relationship information into very tight packages to set up who Krauss is, what his relationships are, who matters in his life, what matters in his life, i.e. the prayer and the idea of yesterday, today, and forever continuity in life, and it also establishes a certain moral code. You understand the kind of principles he probably lives his life by, so that when the more moral dilemmas start appearing in the movie, they have there's some meaning to what that might mean to this character. And so he's giving you just enough of who this man is and who he cares about in life and what he cares about in life to make the experience of what these men went through meaningful to that character, and to you seeing it happen through his eyes. It's not meant to be a classic narrative structure.
And Shelley, it also, I admire the how warm in lighting and the colors that are used in the scene that gives us so much warmth, in stark contrast with the rest of the film. That while you were gone, Aaron and I talked about the blues and the greens and the other colors that you use throughout the film.
Yeah, we certainly wanted to create a visual contrast with her on a color front and also on a camera front as well. I mean, the entire movie is handheld. That scene is not, of course. That scene is much more traditional in terms of cameras on dollies and a much more precise and kind of classic camera. And for sure, a whole end of the color spectrum that we will not see in the film anywhere else. As the film progresses, it gets, from the grays and through the different times of day and the dusks and the dawns, and to more of a full spectrum lighting at the end when their journey is nearing completion. In the case of the Elizabeth Shue scene, one of the things that I liked about it was that scene represented to him something that was unobtainable. There's uncertainty in the world, and it's not something that he could obtain at that moment. And at the end of the film, when there's that cut to her, that I love that cut to her, and it makes me think, okay, if I can cross the Atlantic and do this impossible thing, I can do that. This now makes her obtainable, and I like how that represents, she's the setup for his discovery of his whole inner strength, and his confidence, and so she is a rather important part of the telling of the story, and I do like separating her visually as well.
Mm-hmm. And you had the actors on a gimbal, right? And then you also shot the film on a Steadicam. You know, can you tell us about balancing, you know, the seesaw, the movement,
Yeah.
and with the Steadicam and the gimbal?
Well, a lot of it had to come from really knowing the mechanics of how a ship moves through the ocean. And Aaron was very responsible for that in working out, you know, how the ocean pushes a destroyer around and how that ship responds to the ocean. It doesn't respond in a way a typical larger ship does. Destroyers are actually rather small. So there's a lot of movement, and that movement needed to kind of be represented visually. And whenever you shoot on a motion base like that, you know, there's a lot to it. There's a lot to unlocking the motion base and safetying it and making it safe for everybody on it, and beginning its motion and doing the take and stopping it and locking it all off so it's safe again. And inevitably what happens in the course of shooting is you find ways to turn that motion base off because it's much more efficient to shoot without it. And that's happened on every movie that I've used a motion base on. Except Greyhound. I don't think there's a shot that we ever turn that thing off. And it was somewhat of a diabolical instrument. It was a rough ride, and it moved a lot. And so by having the handheld camera, you know, one thing we were fearing was if we had everything on stabilized heads, you know, these days it's, you know, there's so many, you know, gyro stabilized heads and devices that you can really smooth these things out. We wanted just the opposite of that. We wanted the camera to be affected by the motion and to have it, to feel the weight of the camera moving with the weight of the actors. And there's that one moment where there's that leak in the pilot house, and you can kind of see that leak is not coming down in a plumb way. It's actually moving around with our motion base. So, and those little things add up to quite a lot. And so when it came time to use the Steadicam in a way sort of equalizes that movement out. And so our Steadicam operator, his name was George Billinger. We had him hang on to that Steadicam much more firmly than he normally would, and to actually add a little of that handheld kind of nature back into it, because having that energy was important. There are certain things that a Steadicam does better than handheld. So we went to the Steadicam at those moments. And then transversely, when he got onto the Kid, which of course is rock solid, he could then, because he had spent so much time on the motion base, and our A-camera operator as well, they now could mimic everything they had going on the motion base on now a still set and create that same motion, because by then it was in their muscle memory. They knew what the calculations were. They knew what the movement, the math of all the movement was.
Mm-hmm. Well, gents, I could go on talking to you forever, and we've been talking over an hour. I do have to ask you one last question. You both are cinematographers. Were you guys butting heads with each other, being two great accomplished cinematographers?
No, I have too much respect for Aaron as a cinematographer. I knew who Aaron Schneider was long before this came along, and I was actually very much looking forward to it. And quite frankly, I think that I came out of Greyhound being a better cinematographer, having worked with him. And
oh, that's nice, Shelly.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. It's like it was the opposite of what you would think. If anything, I think Aaron showed me a little more compassion and empathy for some of the things that a cinematographer has to go through on a film that's shot in 35 days. And I think that there was very much a shorthand in terms of focusing on the narrative. And I think that there was a lot of agreement. I think we like to tell stories in a similar way, and
Yeah.
that certainly.
What I noticed most is that because you pretty much know exactly what's going on in a cinematographer's head. When you're working with a normal director, you know, you can hide, you know, your thoughts because the director doesn't know what you're thinking at any given moment. But a cinematographer goes, I know what you're thinking about right now.
Yes.
And so that can go either way, right? If a director who had shot wanted to use that against a cinematographer, you could, but that would be horrible. or you can use it to have a certain empathy, right? We're like, I know this is going to be hard, you know, because it'd be hard for me too. But, and so when a cinematographer feels that empathy, they go, okay, you know, it makes them feel better to know that someone knows the difficulties. Then you're a team. On the other hand, you can also, as a director, you know, a DP is pushing his crew sometimes to, you know, to do their best work. You're a manager. You have to be kind of an inspiration too. So as a director who has been a cinematographer, you can also go, hey, I know this is hard, but you know, we also both know this can be done, you know? So you can use it, you can use that common knowledge to both empathize and try to make a cinematographer's job a little easier. And you can also use it to push them a little because, you know, and I always like to be pushed too when I was shooting. So it goes both ways.
Mm-hmm.
I said that was my last question, but I lied. I have one question. I would kick myself if I didn't ask. One of the moments that takes my breath away, other than the torpedo grazing the boat, and also the collision with the merchant, or close collision with the merchant ship, it's when the camera lifts up and we keep going up into above the clouds and we see the northern lights. It's a stunning moment, takes your breath away. You know, can you tell us the genesis of that moment?
It was actually scripted. Now, screenplays don't typically describe shots, as you know. They're more of a blueprint that would inspire visual ideas from the people reading the screenplay. But when what the camera's doing becomes crucial to the story, screenwriters will often include a description of what they think the camera should be doing. And this was one of those moments for Tom, where he needed, as a screenwriter, he needed a way of transitioning from an intense night battle that was going to go on all night to the aftermath, the morning after, when the battle had died down but was still boiling, right? And so he decided that this shot would help us convey the enormity of what would transpire that night, but also bring us up above the clouds and give us that sort of point of view from the heavens. You know, astronauts describe this overwhelming feeling of when they look back at the Earth of realizing that we're all on one big planet. There's something about that perspective that gives you a sense of us all being together as one. And in some ways, I think that shot is probably Tom's way of communicating a little bit of that if you step back and look at this inside the beauty of the heavens, it gives you a different perspective on what's going on down there. Whatever that means, you know, whatever that means to you, because, you know, it's not like not like we're trying to, you know, we're not trying to be poets. We're trying to inspire.
No, but it is a very poetic and lyrical moment. And I will tell you what I got out of it, because, you know, here's a story about ordinary people that do extraordinary things. And I think that in that shot, it crystallizes, at least it crystallized in me that fact that this movie is about this, as I said, ordinary people that all of a sudden find an inner strength to do something that they didn't know it was capable for them to do.
Well, I'm glad that was effective for you.
Yeah, it's a beautiful. Well, gents, as I said, I could have gone on forever, but we need to wrap it up. It's been such a pleasure. I love talking to you guys, and congratulations on such a great movie.
Thank you.
Great achievement.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for helping us get the word out. anyone who hasn't seen the film, I hope they do, and I hope they enjoy it.
And they see it, I hope they see it several times, because I've seen it several times, and every time I get more and more out of it. It's on Apple TV and Apple Plus.
Apple
and
TV Plus.
Apple TV Plus. Well, thank you guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Roger.